Welcome, and thank you for joining today's teleconference, 2020 Quarter 3 report on market issues and performance. Before we begin, please ensure you have opened the chat panel by using the associated icon located at the bottom of your screen. If you require technical assistance, please send a chat to the event producer. Throughout the presentation, you can submit a written question by selecting all panelists from the drop-down menu in the chat and entering your questions in the message box provided. All audio lines have been muted until the Q&A portion of the call. We will give you instructions on how to ask a question at that time. With that, I will turn the call over to Amelia Blanke, Manager of Monitoring and Reporting. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Jayla. This is our presentation on the Q3 2020 report on market issues and performance. This was an absolutely extraordinary quarter. It is therefore a very long report. A link to that report is located here on the bottom of the screen. I will be able to cover some of the material in our report, but I don't anticipate being able to cover all of it. As always, a tremendous thanks to the team of the Department of Market Monitoring that really puts all of the work in this report together. The credit goes entirely to them, and blame for any errors or typos goes to me. Apologies, as the rest of you, I am currently working, as I presume the rest of you, I'm working from home and unfortunately have a neighbor jackhammering a sidewalk today. So apologies for that, and with that, please do ask questions, stop with questions along the way. If you would like to ask a question, I believe you should press #2, and we'll be able to take the question at that time. If you do have a question on the content of the report, I should be able to address it during the call today. I will ask that if you do have any questions that are outside of the report, please feel free to ask them. I may not be able to answer them, but it will inform the analysis that we're then able to put into our annual report for 2020 this year. So with that, highlights of Q3 2020 market performance. As I mentioned at the beginning of the call, it was actually absolutely historic quarter with load curtailment occurring on August 14th and 15th. This was also the first time in the history of the California ISO market that virtual bidding was suspended. We saw prices and wholesale energy costs increase. This was due to both lower hydro, higher regional demand, and slightly higher gas prices. Overall, we continue to see changes in load. On average, we saw decreased load, mostly due to the increased penetration of behind-the-meter solar, as well as some of the stay-at-home orders associated with the COVID-19 response. But we did see an increase in peak load. That peak load was not only due to seasonal high regional demand, which was driven by temperature, but also in part due to the increase in stay-at-home, which can lead to increased high demand as well. We saw an increase as well in generation outages, in congestion, offset costs, ancillary service costs, bid cost recovery, and losses to ratepayers from congestion revenue rates. In our Western energy imbalance market, we saw a very unusual pattern. For the first time since I've been doing these reports, we saw peak prices in NV energy Arizona Public Service and Salt River Project, which exceeded the rest of the system. We continue to see Northwest prices, which were regularly lower than the rest of the system due to limited transfer capability. Sufficiency test failures and power balance violations, which are often following those sufficiency test failures, drove prices up, particularly in NV energy. And finally, I mentioned that significant transfer capability between the ISO and the southwestern VAs allowed energy to flow within the energy imbalance market with relatively little congestion in that area. Finally, part of the reason I think this may be a record long quarterly report, and I just noticed a typo, so I'll fix that later, is that it contains a lot of special issue coverage. We include some coverage of the load curtailment event, but in addition to that, I point you to our special report which covers that event, and it is available on our website, which includes a much longer treatment. As a follow-up to our coverage of that load curtailment event, we have an analysis of load under scheduling, which we are able to do at this time due to the availability of meter data, hourly block import compensation, resource adequacy showings and performance, and an additional coverage of system market power, structural competitiveness, bidding behavior, and to conclude, an impact that market power had very little effect on system prices. Total CAISO Q3 wholesale energy costs were up almost 60% compared to the prior Q3 of 2019. Total wholesale energy costs for the quarter were $3.8 billion. That change was due to lower hydroelectric generation availability, as well as periods of high load and slightly higher gas prices. This chart, which for those of you who are familiar with our reports will know, shows average cost in blue, and in yellow shows the average cost normalized to gas price, including greenhouse gas adjustments. Overall, the green line shows the average daily gas price, and that's a load-weighted combination of PG&E, Citygate, and SoCal Citygate, including greenhouse gas adjustments. Accounting for the gas and greenhouse gas price changes, the wholesale energy cost in Q3 was $64 per megawatt hour, up from $42 per megawatt hour in Q3 of 2019. One of the things that we track most closely are changes in gas prices. That is because we often find that changes in gas prices are drivers for, apologies for the dog, are drivers for changes in our wholesale energy costs. This chart is showing monthly average prices at hubs across the West. When comparing Q3 prices, so that's July through September of 2019 to Q3 prices in 2020, we see that there's a slight increase, so it's about 4% load weighted. That change is dwarfed by the change going back to the beginning of 2019. You can keep this in mind. This is actually regional, so the two we track most closely are PG&E Citygate in yellow and SoCal Citygate in red. Keep this pattern in mind as we switch to the next chart, which shows monthly prices. You'll note on this chart, monthly average prices were high in Q3 of 2020, but not as high in August, particularly as they had been in February of 2019. I think it's instructive to compare these two periods. In February of 2019, we had very high average gas prices, and we see in the wholesale market, day-ahead 15-minute and 5-minute prices that are high as well. In August of 2020, our gas prices were lower, but we are seeing higher electricity prices. In this case, we're seeing a substantial difference between day-ahead prices, which are $47 a megawatt hour, in excess of 15-minute at 44 and 5-minute prices at 36. That pattern is driven by a difference in the frequency of very high price intervals. This chart, as most of our metrics, is looking at average values. This slide is comparing frequencies. The top chart looks at the percent of hours in our day-ahead market. The middle chart looks at the percent of 15-minute intervals, and the bottom chart looks at the percent of 5-minute intervals. The categories, the scales are the same for all three markets, but the categories are a little bit different. On the day-ahead, we're looking at $100 to $200 and $200 to $350, whereas in the two real-time markets, we're looking at $250 to $500 and $500 to $750. Even so, you can see that the day-ahead frequency of high-price intervals was greater than the 15-minute market, which was itself greater than the 5-minute market. One of the factors that we see driving these changes in prices is a change in load. This is actually a chart from our last annual report, which looks at the changes that we see in the load profile over time. These are average annual load values for 2017, 2018, and 2019. And here you can really see the impact of the behind-the-meter solar in the middle of the day, as well as energy efficiency, and in 2019, particularly lower temperatures. When we look at the same analysis for Q3, and this is for Q3 only, for 2018, 2019, and 2020, we're seeing in the green at the bottom lower loads on average in the early hours of the workday, but very similar load. It's in fact overlapping for much of the net load ramp period leading into hour day 19. One of the other factors that drove the relatively high prices in Q3 was a reduction in renewable generation. Of the utility scale generation that we're tracking here, which is hydro, solar, and wind, we saw overall a 16% reduction relative to 2019, entirely due to a reduction of 38% from hydro. As a reminder, I think our snowpack heading into 2020 was at about 50%. Compared to something on the order of 175% of normal for the year prior. We continue to see average prices that are driven by the net load. The red dashed line here is showing our average net load for Q3. I'll point out that our net load, which is load minus utility scale wind and solar, is lower in the middle of the day than it is in the very early hours of the morning. This has been true for some time. We continue to see that our peak prices are occurring in hours ending 19 and 20. It's also during these hours that you see the gap between day ahead and particularly the 5-minute real-time price. This chart is showing the average net load by month in green, paired with a maximum monthly net load and a minimum monthly net load. We added this analysis to the report to highlight the very high net loads that we saw during Q3, as well as the growing variation in net load that is driving some of those intervals in which we see very high prices. With that, I will stop for questions.
As a reminder, dialing #2 on your telephone keypad will enter you into the question queue. You will hear a notification when your line is unmuted, and at that time, please state your name and affiliation and your question. Once again, that's #2. And I see we have a caller in the queue already. Your line is unmuted. Please go ahead.
Good afternoon, State Francis at DTE Energy. On slide 4, in general, when DMM speaks about load underscheduling, is there a strict definition for what that means for you guys?
I will cover some of this in some later slides. We look at two things. One in comparison to, both in comparison to metered load. We look at both the difference between self-scheduled load bids in the day-ahead market compared to metered load, as well as cleared day-ahead load. Where there is a gap there that has been termed in the root cause kind of analysis and our heat wave analysis to be underscheduling.
So
That's
if load is not self-scheduling to maintain price control, does that really just highlight a difference between potentially, you have the difference you see between what was cleared and what was metered, but don't you also potentially have a forecast error component where if the load legitimately bid what they thought their forecast was going to, what their load would be based on their forecast, do you look at that error at all either?
Unfortunately, I don't have access to the forecast. I have access to the system-wide. We in DMM have access to the day-ahead forecast, and we have looked at sort of the scheduling against that day-ahead forecast. I don't have the load-serving entity-specific forecast to be able to do that on an entity-by-entity basis.
Right. To the extent you guys could share at some point because I'm sure load to believe is doing its best job, but then, accusation is too strong a word, but you'll get at least noticed for something called load underscheduling. I struggle to reconcile how load maintains price control without self-scheduling, and I don't think DMM is suggesting, unless you are, that load should entirely self-schedule.
No, it's an analysis that we're producing really in response to some questions that we received as a follow-up to the heat wave analysis. And I'll put this in context for the later slide, but the issue there is that when there is less self-scheduling of day-ahead load in the presence of convergence bidding or virtual bidding, that can allow additional kinds of demand to clear.
But that's also the reflection of a market that awards by bid price and price signal. So, okay, I was just curious if
exactly.
I just want to make sure I understood what underscheduling means, because it feels like it is a misnomer if in fact load is doing exactly what it wants to do relative to its own forecast and maintain an ability in the IFM to keep price sensitivity. Okay, that's what I needed. Thank you.
You are welcome. Are there any other questions?
There are no other questions in the queue at this time.
Okay. One of the other things that we have been tracking and anticipating some changes having to do with the orders that went into place to control COVID-19 was outages and rates of outages. This chart looks at quarterly maximum, average and maximum daily outages by type. What we're seeing here is that the other forced outages and forced outages shown in blue and red in Q3 are almost just by themselves as high as our average quarter three outages from 2016 to 2017, 2018, 2019 altogether. And we continue to see planned outages, although the planned outages are smaller than in prior years. Overall outages were higher than average for Q3. One of the other themes, and I think that you'll see this also in our energy imbalance market prices, was relatively high prices in the Southwest. This chart is comparing CAISO day-ahead energy prices during peak hours in blue to Palo Verde, shown in green, and the Mid-Columbia, Mid-Sea peak prices shown in yellow. As you can see in the August period, in yet another, I think, historic circumstance, there were cleared bilateral index prices above the wet soft offer cap. And you can see that in the average prices that are shown here. As a whole, we're showing the average monthly prices, and just comparing there, you can see that the average prices at Palo Verde over the months, not just during that peak period, were higher than the ISO. As I think you would expect, given that kind of market signal, we saw an increase in exports in the third quarter. This chart is comparing average hourly net interchange by quarter, comparing each quarter to the quarter in the year prior. So in the final panel, we have a comparison of 2020 Q3 to 2019 Q3, showing day-ahead values in blue, 15-minute market values in yellow, and finally net interchange before and after EIM in gray and black. So you can see below the x-axis there's a definite increase in exports, which I think is to be expected given the market signals that we can see in the bilateral market. Overall, net interchange did not decrease as much as that increase in exports would predict. One of the other changes that we saw during the quarter is an increase in congestion. Congestion overall increased to 220 million of day-ahead congestion rent, which was more than double the third quarter of 2019 when we saw 79 million. Looking at the time, so I'm going to speed up just a bit here. Congestion, one of the metrics that DMM has been tracking for quite a long time is the losses to ratepayers from congestion revenue rights sold in the ISO auction. These in the third quarter were $38 million less than payments made to non-load serving entities and account for about 17% of day-ahead congestion rent. That is in line with the, as a percent of congestion rent, with the most recent quarters, Q4, Q1, and Q2, and a little bit higher than in the first 3 quarters of 2019, right after the Track 1A and Track 1B changes went into the congestion revenue rights auction process. As a percent of congestion rent, losses to ratepayers are lower than they had been historically prior to those, prior to the changes that went in place in 2019. One of the most striking outcomes of the analysis that we did for Q3 was a dramatic increase in real-time offset costs in the quarter. Overall, these increased to $104 million. That's made up of $56 million in real-time imbalance energy offset costs and about $50 million in real-time congestion offsets, offset by a surplus in the loss direction of about $2 million. Overall, for the quarter, $104 million is almost by itself higher than the total offset cost for 2019, which was $105 million. So a very substantial increase. Ancillary service payments also increased significantly to about $97 million. So that's slightly less than the total offset cost in some. Predominantly an increase in the total cost of spin. This was due to both the increased energy costs as well as higher requirements and an increased frequency of scarcity. Bid cost recovery payments rose to $62 million, which is about $14 million more than the third quarter of 2019. This chart looks at the average hourly energy from the exceptional dispatch. Here we're seeing on average that the average hourly energy from exceptional dispatch in Q3 was quite similar to Q3 of 2019, both in sum and as a percent of load. The costs of that exceptional dispatch were substantially lower than 2019. And just quickly, there are a few potential reasons for that, including one, that prices were high. Because prices were high, there's less frequency of exceptional dispatch at a price above the prevailing price at the node, as well as less bid cost recovery associated with resources that are unable to, that require make-whole payments. One of the, we've been tracking operator adjustments and operator actions. We have been highlighting a prevailing pattern in operator use of imbalance conformance. This chart is looking at something a little different, and it is a chart we've been publishing for quite a long time, but it answers a question I've been getting frequently out of the root cause analysis, so I'll highlight this here today. This is looking at RUC requirements, and this, I think, addresses part of Dave Francis's question as well. Following the ISM market there's a run called the residual unit commitment. That run, rather than running against a bid-in load requirement, runs against a load forecast, and it compares the difference between a day-ahead forecast load minus day-ahead cleared capacity, less cleared virtual supply, and which is here shown in green, and an adjustment for predicted under-scheduled intermittent resources shown in yellow. The RUC requirement can also include an operator adjustment, which is here shown in red. We have historically seen the use of operator adjustments to RUC through the high load season, and you can see that there was some use of this also in 2019. We saw a substantial increase in the use of this operator adjustment in the Q3 of 2020. Note this is also one of the first instances in which we saw RUC in feasibilities. Those are cases in which the physical supply does not meet the total RUC requirement. There is a chart showing that in the quarterly report. With that, before I move on to the energy imbalance market, I'll stop and take questions.
As a reminder, dialing #2 will place you in the queue. We already have 2 callers in the queue. Caller, your line is now unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hey, Amelia, this is Michelle Keto from the CPUC. I have 2 quick questions. When you talk about operator error, is that typically a forecast error adjustment, or is that some concern about the resources actually showing up?
Not operator error, but operator adjustment.
Yeah,
so this is an increase.
Yeah.
This is an increase to the RUC demand.
Okay, but would so
it doesn't need to be justified by, it doesn't need to have a particular reason associated with it.
But is there any understanding? Does someone go talk to them and say, do you think that the forecast is wrong, or are you just afraid the resources won't show up? Right, because doesn't that have an impact on day-ahead markets, right? The day-ahead market enhancements. Anyway, just a thought. So talk to them about why they do it, if they think the forecast is wrong. Okay,
they
that was my
absolutely have they have a systematic way of looking at this. It is a concern about lining up the physical capacity to ensure that there's enough physical capacity online to meet reliability requirements.
Okay, so it's not necessarily about that they think the RUC forecast is wrong. It's just that they're uncertain about the resources that are in their portfolio, so they're adjusting upward to get more resources. Okay, and then my other question is, when you talk about the offset costs, are those like real-time purchases that the operators are making? Are those out-of-market purchases and imports, or can you just give some color on what those are?
No. The offset costs account for differences between essentially what's paid by load and what is paid to generation. So for the congestion offset costs, which account for about half of what we saw, we've seen persistent sort of over time that when there is congestion and you see lower limits in the real time than in the day ahead, that can lead to significant congestion offsets.
Okay, sorry, I didn't.
Lower quantity, being sold. And it's a similar, there have been instances of very high energy offsets before. Sometimes those are associated with, for instance, a metering error can cause those energy offsets as well. This in this case, we're still looking into it, but it does indicate that there is supply, there's generation that's being paid on one hand, that the load was not, it wasn't being paid by load through the market. And this is the offset, the accounting offset that's needed to account for that. So
okay,
these
so
are
some sort of uplift.
Exactly. These are the settlement numbers that are available to us at the time. I would expect to see that by the time we run this for the annual report, we may see lower offsets as those costs are accounted for elsewhere in the market.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Can I take the next question?
Yes. Next caller, your line is now unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi, Amelia. It's Mark Smith with Calpine. Yeah, I want to follow up on Michelle's question, actually, from slide 24. I think what you're showing there is operator adjustments only made in RUC, not necessarily operator adjustments that would be made after RUC, for instance, biasing the load forecast prior to HASP, our ad scheduling process. Is that right? Are you going to talk about HASP biases as well?
That is correct. These are only showing operator adjustments in the RUC. I do not have a slide for operator for load bias in the HASP, but we did publish it in the report. We continue to see the same kind of very high imbalance conformance, especially at the net load peak, which we've seen actually since 2017.
And I think that probably goes to Michelle's question a little more directly, that the operators are looking at the net load ramps and are concerned with the performance of the resources that are about to be picked or have been picked. That I think more so maybe than what's being done in RUC. Okay, that was a statement, not a question. Thanks, Amelia.
Yeah. You are welcome. Okay. I will, in the interest of time, move on to the energy imbalance market in our real-time, which includes the CAISO real-time market as well. This chart is showing average hourly prices in the 15-minute market. And the gray dashed line is showing the PG&E price for the PG&E DLAP and the ISO. So you can see here in the yellow, NV Energy had fairly high prices through the peak in the 15-minute market, and it's actually hiding there behind the green, but APS and Salt River Project in light green also had high prices over the peak. That's a new pattern for the energy imbalance market. As I mentioned at the top of the call, we continue to see lower prices in the Northwest region, which here includes Pacific Northwest, Puget Sound Energy, Portland General Electric, and Seattle City Lights. When we look at the same kind of average hourly pattern over months, this shows the same increase, really, that we're seeing for NV Energy, particularly in yellow. This chart shows the frequency of upward flexible ramp failure sufficiency test failures by month. This shows stacked the failures by area. As shown in yellow, NV Energy had a relatively high frequency of failed flexible ramping sufficiency tests. One of the most popular charts typically in our report is the map that shows the transfers between areas. We have now reached a point where the number of areas is high enough that that becomes a challenge to produce. What we're showing next to the map here is a summary of congestion frequency by area, both in our 15-minute market and our 5-minute markets. So that shows the percentage with which that area is separated from the rest of the EIM system and the price impact associated with that. I'll just highlight in those same northwestern areas that we're continuing to see these high frequencies of congestion associated with lower prices on average. This is our new table, which replaces the map. Shown in left are the from balancing authority areas. Shown on the top are the two balancing areas, and in the table itself, we are showing the average 15-minute market energy imbalance market limit from Area 1 to Area 2. I'll highlight there that we see some areas with zero limit. If there is no potential limit between the two areas, we've left that cell blank. We continue to see, on average, that there is no available EIM transmission capacity between, for example, PowerX or Puget Sound Energy and the CAISO. With that, I will move on to the special issues section, and I will stop after about halfway through for questions. As I mentioned also at the top of the call, DMM published a long report on the load curtailment event and the high demand period which followed. Our key findings are repeated here, but they are also available on our webpage. In large part, we agreed with the joint analysis published by the CAISO, CPUC, and CEC that the load curtailments were really due to a combination of factors. In addition, we had some additional findings based on our analysis, particularly, and I think the one that has gotten the most attention is that market results on these days don't appear to be the result of market manipulation. Our recommendations coming out of that report focus on resource adequacy, both increasing requirements and working to clarify and revise counting rules, as well as exports and imports. And for exports, we're asking for further changes and clarification in the rules and process for limiting and curtailing exports. And that is a discussion that is happening within the CAISO as part of the set of summer enhancements going in place before the summer of 2021. Finally, for demand response, the set of recommendations to ensure that a higher proportion of that demand response is available during the critical net load hours. To get to Dave's question, one of the follow-ups which we included in this report is a comparison of the self-scheduled load, shown in the yellow, to actual load. This is showing on a market-wide level. Then we have also looked at that by load serving entity type. And then we're also looking at the cleared day-ahead physical load. And as I said in response to Dave's question, the reason that this is gaining attention is that lower percents of lower cleared load in the day-ahead market can allow other demand to clear. And that, in fact, happened on some of these days where we saw an increase in economic exports, which cleared, and then prior to changes which the ISO put into place on September 5th were passed into the real-time market with scheduling priority in excess of load. When we break this down by type, what we see is that on the 13th, 14th, and 15th, in the early part of the heat wave, we see about half of the underscheduling from IOUs shown in green and about a little more than half from CCAs shown in red. Beginning on the 17th and through the rest of this high demand period, when, as a reminder, we had day-ahead forecasts that were substantially above actual load. On these days, what we're seeing is actually, you could say, overscheduling by IOUs, direct access and munis, and continued underscheduling from CCAs in most hours. Actual load was lower on these days due to a combination of, I think, extraordinary efforts from both CAISO market participants as well as other entities, including the state agencies as well as the state government, which allowed our load to be lower. One of the other sort of concerns being addressed in the summer reliability and enhancements that are being considered is the potential for a type of bid cost recovery for hour-ahead import schedule. We published a special section on this. It's something that we monitor on a regular basis, but so this explains what we see. We are comparing here the revenue which would be received for hour-ahead schedules if settled at the hour-ahead price, and we're comparing that revenue to the current settlement, which is at the FMM price. Obviously, it depends on the particular position and the difference in prices, but overall, we find that on average, the hour-ahead import schedules which clear in the market are generally receiving higher revenue by being compensated at the 15-minute market price. And with that, I will stop for just a couple questions, and then I want to make sure I get to talk about the last slides in the deck.
All right. We do have a couple questions in the queue. First caller, your line is now unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hey, Amelia. Dan Williams from Customized Energy Solutions. I'll try and make this quick. I always wish that they would give you 3 hours instead of 1 hour for this, just because you have so much good information to share. Just a request, on the slide that Mark and Michelle were talking about, it would be great to see box and whiskers on those in the future instead of just the simple averages, just to kind of help define that better. But my questions on the EIM transfers, are the transfers that you're showing a maximum or simultaneous capability of transfers into California?
Sorry to take you so far back. What we're showing here are the limits. So those are the ETSR limits, constraint limits.
So, and this is maybe just something to follow up in a future time, but does that strike you as exceptionally large relative to the overall real-time demand in the CAISO? And does that cause DMM any concerns, influence that those transfers have on CRRs, on price performance relative to the day-ahead market. We just, I guess, appreciate some more sharing of DMM's thoughts on kind of the, impact of having such a large transfer quantity, even, recognizing that you did say that they're limited by GHG bids relatively frequently, but just kind of curious. So we can save that for the future, just a point of question.
I appreciate that, and I'll reiterate again that if you do have follow-up questions or there's something you think we should cover in more detail, please do feel free to reach out to me personally, and I too wish we had longer to talk about all of this. This table was produced in our heat wave report. It's looking at the availability of resource adequacy in the hours of the load curtailment. For the Q3 report, we also looked at the higher overall highest 210 load hours for the quarter, and we compared that to the availability in the highest load hours of 2019, which was a much lower priced year. Overall, the availability was about the same, to cut to the chase. Roughly less than half of our RA capacity is being met by resources that have traditional must-offer obligations, and the remainder is being met by resources with more limited availability. We were also able to report on the self-reported performance from demand response. So this chart is comparing the demand response resource adequacy value, shown in blue, to real-time availability in yellow based on bids, compared to the dispatch overall in red, and the reported response, that is the self-reported response of the demand response resources shown there in green. One of the other resource types that has gotten a lot of attention is storage. This is showing average real-time battery schedules over that high demand period, August 14th and 18th. And what you can see here in yellow is both energy charging and energy discharging. And of particular note, I think, is the energy charging, which you see a little bit in hours ending 19 and 20, and more substantially in hours 21 and 22. What we're seeing there are the results of, predominantly the result of economic charge bids, which cleared in part due to the less than $1,000 prices that were seen in our real-time market. Finally, and this is, I know I'm rushing through, but I really want to get to these slides. Finally, we were able to rerun the market with our competitive scenario. That competitive scenario replaces gas bids, both commitment cost and energy, with the lower of the bid and a reference value, and also replaces the very highest import bids with a generous BEB. When we do that, we find that on average, the quarterly average price cost markup was about $1.42, or about 2.6%, which is overall very competitive. Shown in the chart here, yellow and green are overlapping, so it's the average base case or day-ahead price compared to the blue, which is the average load-weighted scenario price. We also look at the structural competitiveness. The CAISO market was structurally uncompetitive during the high load days in August, and I think for a record number of hours, actually, for a quarter in Q3. Here in green, we're showing the RSI 3 less than 1, in yellow RSI 2, and in red RSI 1. In this chart, I'll just note that 2019 is somewhat of an anomaly, and I think that's clear in the average prices from that period. This chart is a comparison of the hours with potential scarcity to hours that are potentially non-competitive. What we're showing on the left is the price in the hour, and on the x-axis we're showing the reserve margin, so our modeled system-wide supply relative to demand. Here what you can see is really for every hour in which we have a potential scarcity, there's a much larger number of hours in which there is the potential for exercise of market power. And that's what we're showing here. This is, I think, my last slide. One of the ways that our results have been characterized is by a statement that says that there was no exercise of system market power. That's not actually what we're saying. What we're saying is that the market results do not appear to be the result of the exercise of market power. Here what we're showing is a comparison for gas-fired units on August 18th, hour ending 19, of bids shown in blue. These are for incremental energy bids, compared to a minimum of the bid and the default energy bid shown in the red dashed line. So as you can see here, there were a substantial number of bids that were, a quantity of bids that was above the default energy bid. And with that, I will take any last questions. I think we can stay on the line for another 5 minutes or so.
I see we have a question in the queue. Caller, your line is now unmuted. Please go ahead.
Yes, hi, good afternoon, Amelia. My name is Luke Tugas. I'm a consultant for the California Efficiency and Demand Management Council. Thanks for this presentation today. I definitely enjoy it. Can you please go to slide 39?
Okay, apologies,
Okay, so,
I can't see the slide. I'm assuming this is the right one.
Yes, that's the right one. Sorry. So a few questions for you. One is, clearly it shows a gap between the DRRA value and then the DRRA availability for real-time in the real-time market. Does this account for any sort of, or does this account for the fact that some of the DRRA resources are long-star resources and therefore not available in the day-ahead market? I'm sorry, in the real-time market?
This is purely a measure of the available as bid into the real-time market capacity. So if a resource needed to be dispatched in the day-ahead market to be bid into the real-time market and did not do so, we would not include it here.
Okay, got it. Thank you. And then can you expand a little bit on the reported response? I think you had said that the response was based on data given to you by the DR providers. Is that accurate?
This is based on the settlement values that are submitted to the CAISO. The way that demand response settlement works in the CAISO is that in the market is that the final metered values are compared to a baseline that both the meter data is submitted as any other resource, and then the baselines are submitted separately, and it's that difference that creates the settled response, which is what we're measuring here. There's been some discussion of caps that are put into the market on those baseline values. If the caps were removed, that difference could have been potentially larger than what we are settling and what we're reporting here. We, however, in analyzing this, have not seen that the response reaches the dispatch, even in cases where we lift the cap and do a counterfactual analysis.
Got it. Okay. Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Yeah, you're very welcome. Are there any other questions?
Seems we have no further callers in the queue.
Okay, with that, thank you everybody for your time today. I will once again suggest that if you do have any questions, I suggest reading the report, please, and then do feel free to reach out and contact us. We use all of your questions as a guide to the things that are interesting to market participants and readers and regulators, and use that to focus our public reports, annual reports, as well as special reports. So please do feel free to send me questions. I appreciate it, and thank you all for your time today.
That concludes our conference. Thank you for using Event Services. You may now disconnect.